and I, like one lost in a thorny wood that rents the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown, and from that torment I will free myself or hew my way out with a bloody axe. Why? I can smile and murder while I smile. I can add colors to the chameleon, change shapes with Proteus for advantages, and set the murderous Machiavel to school. Can I do this and cannot get a crown? Tut.
I thought I'd make a video because I just finished watching The White Queen by Philippa Gregory that was on Stars. I thought I would make a video about how Richard III has been portrayed in fiction. You guys know this about me if you've been watching my videos for a while. I do have reservations about fictionalizing real people. I think it's just a meism. But we get people like Philippa Gregory who like to stretch the truth by ignoring it. And I was thinking, I was like, how bad can that really be if Shakespeare did it? Because Shakespeare played fast and loose with the truth, boy. And if there is someone for whom the truth is hidden, it is definitely Richard III. If you don't know much about Richard III, one, what world do you live in? And two, I'll go ahead and tell you, Richard III is considered the last medieval king of England, although I kind of think Henry Tudor, who succeeded him, Henry VIII's father, was still had a pretty medieval mindset. But in England, the English consider the downfall of Richard III the end of the Middle Ages in England. So, Richard III was a Yorkist. You've probably heard of the Wars of the Roses. If you haven't, what world do you live in? But chances are, if you're watching this, you've probably heard of the Wars of the Roses because you probably know a little bit about fantasy. And if you know anything about fantasy, I'm sure you know about George R.R. Martin. If you know anything about him, you know he based Game of Thrones off the War of the Roses. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Shakespeare wrote kind of an epic. Some people say tetralogy. Some people say it was meant to be eight plays. They're all considered the same. We don't have Shakespeare here to tell us, but it's called the Henriade, where it is an epic story with an epic hero of the fall of the Middle Ages and the Plantagenet house in England. So most of you know my last name is Norman. The Norman kings came over to England with William the Conqueror from Normandy. People from Normandy are called Normans. William the Conqueror, his son died in a disaster called, no, not his son, his grandson, died in a disaster called the White Ship, where a ship sank and it killed a lot of members of the royal family. This caused a succession crisis, a civil war known as the Anarchy, which oftentimes by armchair historians are confused, or the Anarchy and the War of the Roses is confused. No, War of the Roses is a little bit more famous, probably because of George R.R. Martin, and it's so romantic, the white rose and the red rose battling it out for the crown of England. But the Plantagenet house came to be because of William the Conqueror's granddaughter, Matilda, otherwise known as Maud. Her claim to the English throne, she wanted the throne after her father, Henry II, died of food poisoning, actually. And she didn't get it because she was a woman, but her son did. And she had married into the French house of Anjou, or Plantagenet. So that is where the Plantagenet, however you want to say it, came to be. So that house ruled England for a very long time, from the middle of the 1100s until 1485. And yes, 1485, we have an exact date. Richard III was killed August 22nd, 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. That's said just because of his death, because as legend goes, he was unhorsed. They needed to get the king back on the horse so he wouldn't die, but he died, and Henry Tudor and the Tudor reign began. This crisis that culminated in the War of the Roses all started with the deposition of Richard II, who was son of Edward, grandson of Edward III, who is the most beloved king in English history, if not one of the most beloved. He had amazing military campaigns in France during the 100 Years' War. He got lots of territory. He died, but the way the monarchy worked was that it went to his grandson, Richard II, who was like 10. And a lot of people think he also might have had schizophrenia, so he was mentally unstable. Went to his grandson, Richard II, because his son, Edward the Black Prince, had already died. So this whole mess started when Richard II proved an unfit king, and Henry Bolingbroke, otherwise known as Henry IV, deposed him. And there's actually an interesting story about the deposition scene. Elizabeth I, who was the granddaughter of Henry Tudor, was on the throne at the time of Shakespeare writing his earlier plays, and her master of the revels, so like her party manager, his job got kind of messed up and it turned more into censorship than actually parties. So her party planner censored that scene and took it out because it maybe came across as too treasonous, because the Lancaster, which was a faction of the Plantagenet, meaning that it was a line brought forth by younger sons. So Henry Bolingbroke was a Lancaster. He descended from like the Duke of Lancaster. He took the crown, and it was obviously by force, and so it came across as a little too treasonous, so they took it out. But Shakespeare wrote Richard II, which I think is so underrated. It's such a great play. I love the language in the soliloquy after he's deposed, where he says, "Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs, make dust our paper." And it's just so, because he's talking about death, and he's like, "I'm a king, but I've been deposed. How can you tell me I'm a king?" Richard II, and then Henry IV parts 1 and 2, which have the character Falstaff in them, and Falstaff's really funny. He's beloved. And then that tetralogy concludes with Henry V, and a lot of people argue that this is really kind of a coming-of-age story of an epic hero, our guy, Henry V, and he's the epic hero. He wins the Battle of Agincourt and brings delight in his wonderful reign. At the end of the play, he marries Catherine, who's the daughter of the French king, and they bring peace for a little bit. So it starts off in the dark and comes in through the light. There's a second tetralogy. Some people think that it was written to be separate. Other people think this is part of a huge epic story. It's Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3, and then Richard III. Did you guys know, actually, that famous, chilling speech that Ralph Fiennes gave us at the beginning of the video is actually from Henry VI, Part 3, Act 3, Scene 2. It's not in Richard III, although it is in a lot of adaptations. The directors will put it in there just because it's so awful. Richard III in real life, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that he didn't start out as being the monster Shakespeare portrays. And guys, Richard III is one of the most cartoony monsters in the most cartoony, mustache-twirling villain, I think, to exist. I mean, just look. Look right there. Look how, you can't see my arm, but look how cartoony that guy looks. He's a mustache-twirling villain who killed his nephews in the tower, and he just, in the beginning, he straight up tells us how bad he is. "I can smile and murder whilst I smile, and wet my cheeks with artificial tears, and frame my face to all occasions." He's just sick. But Philippa Gregory portrays him quite differently. He's an eager youth, he's a romantic, but then when his brother dies, he starts suffering from some paranoia. Maybe he was under the influence of witchcraft, which we know isn't true. Did he murder his nephews in the towers? Philippa Gregory really doesn't take a position. She doesn't pretend to know what happened, but I will pretend to know what happened really, really quickly. So the princes in the tower, they both weren't princes. One was King Edward V, and the other was Richard of Salisbury, or the Duke of York. So basically, I think they were smothered with their bedclothes, with their pillows, on the order of Richard III. I think he did it out of panic. I think he had some good reasons for unseating his nephew. Maybe he did have a better claim. He declared his nephews illegitimate because they said his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, who's a major character in Philippa Gregory's Cousins War series. So Red Queen, White Queen, Kingmaker's daughter. She's a huge character in all of those. And he was, like, Edward was betrothed to someone before. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. There were rumors. It doesn't really matter with the culmination of what happened. I think Richard did fall into a paranoia. We can see that in some of the historical documents of just how frightened and paranoid he was of losing his crown, which was a real concern. He didn't have an heir. His son had died. His wife had died. He was probably in a sexual relationship with Elizabeth of York, who was his niece. It's disgusting, but England, the crown. I think he did it. I think he ordered the deaths of his nephews out of panic. And in about 1670 something, 2 bodies were discovered under a staircase during renovation. They were seen to be the bodies of 2 young boys, and they had velvet buried among them. If that does not signify that the princes were killed, who or why somebody killed them, I think we're good enough now at cold case investigations to go back and maybe decide without a reasonable doubt who killed them and why. We do it all the time for cold cases. Just because one's ancient doesn't mean I don't think we can use the same, we can't use the same materials and methods that we use to solve, 50-year-old cold cases versus 500-year-old cold cases. Why not, Those are my thoughts on the way Richard III is portrayed in fiction. I love Shakespeare. I'm a huge Shakespeare nerd, but I make it quite clear always that I think Richard III, because it's overly long, like worse than Shakespeare's other plays are overly long. I mean, it's the second longest play that he wrote. I think Titus Andronicus a little bit longer, but it was also an early one, and he just wasn't as good of a writer yet when he was writing a lot of these histories as he was later when he wrote Macbeth and King Lear and Henry V, which was written in 1600, which was amazing. So Richard III, I think, is a very easy villain to hate, and he makes a good canvas to just explore the vileness. We saw Ralph Fiennes give his chilling little monologue. So I'll leave you guys with that. I'm working on Nano. I'm not doing great. I am fictionalizing a historical figure who people know very little about. But it's going slow. I thought I would take a moment because I haven't made a video in a while, but these are my thoughts of Richard III in fiction. See you guys.